All right, crew, let's talk about training volume. More specifically, progressive overload and a simple approach that I think is worth people considering taking to their training. I completed a check-in for my man here on the screen yesterday, Camille, who is in Amsterdam. And actually, fun side note for him, going from classic to opens, it's going to be some fun times. Anyway, here he is at 116 kilograms. And we were talking about his current programming that we began a few weeks ago back now. And Camille is one of those guys that is very, very internally focused and exceptionally good at adhering to RIRs in regards to like finding his proximity to failure. But he's also very strong. Now, Camille has some body parts that I would say are asymmetrically behind other body parts, in that we're going to have to specifically target particular things for him in his programming, i.e. he needs bigger legs. He's got a great chest. He's got a great back, but he needs bigger arms. So his programming itself is quite advanced in that its focus is quite asymmetrical. And that's probably a video for another time. But one of the things with Camille is, despite the fact that he needs to grow legs, he is incredibly strong. He's incredibly strong through hinging and RDLs. He's incredibly strong in isolated hamstring curls. He's incredibly strong in the hack squat. And he's finding already within his relatively early career that the sheer load that he can withstand in regards to his strength, his neurological drive in regards to how much force he can produce, isn't always resulting in the same degree of growth as what you would expect from the absolute load progressions. And he's also running into some issues with regards to potential like ligament, tendon, and joint pain and inflammation. And the question he posed to me was, is there a better way for us to drive growth other than progressive overload? With the thought being that progressive overload is primarily focusing on the absolute progression of load on the bar. Anyway, I decided to unpack that for him in his check-in, which I'm going to show you a portion of that check-in here because I think it's got some great discussion around progressive overload, the understanding of what tension really is, how we can then progress. And then after that, I'm going to take you through an example program of somebody with less of an asymmetrical programming system as to what we have set up with Camille, more of a well-balanced one that includes both upper and lower focus, and how you can utilize a simple effort plus set progression model in an advanced or moderate advanced lifter who really understands their RIRs. So stay tuned, enjoy. Any questions, you know where to put them. Also give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. Now, this last one here, I think the main thing that I really wanted to comment on, let me just double check our conversation here though, was the thought that more weight is the requirement for progressive overload. That isn't necessarily the case. The concept of like progressive is that something is progressive, and overload is the same concept as progression, really. Both an overloading principle is a progressive principle. Now, if we're talking about like what might be the greatest driver of hypertrophy, it's pretty well elucidated that they believe that to be mechanical tension. But then again, most people hear mechanical tension and they think load, then they think more load, more mechanical tension, more growth. That's not necessarily the case. Tension is a cumulative impact on the muscle cell itself from the demand that it's being placed under. In that, as you get closer and closer and closer to failure, the tension within that tissue begins to build to the point where there's a tipping point whereby it seems that within 3 to 5 repetitions from failure, that tension starts to accumulate at a rate that then drives a greater hypertrophic response than what you see in the repetitions prior, at least like from a significance difference. But then the difference from probably like 3 from failure to 2 from failure to 1 from failure to 0 from failure, albeit is more stimulatory for growth, is not significantly more stimulatory to the point where you could probably say, if you're doing at least 1 to 3 reps from failure, you are by default going to be getting a pretty maximally stimulatory set. So then the progressive component of that is, if you think about it, you have X amount of weight with 3 reps from failure. You then classify that as like 1 effective rep, 2 reps from failure, 2 effective reps, 1 rep from failure, 3 effective reps, 0 reps from failure, 4 effective reps. So you can pretty much say like within 3 reps from failure from all sets, you're getting 4 effective reps. If you want to progress or overload that volume principle, all you need to do is do more effective reps, which is 1 additional set. It might be 1 additional set of 1 rep, 1 additional set of 2 reps, 3 reps, 4 reps, right? There's an opportunity to take more and more progressive overload through sets of various degrees. It could be a rest pause set for just 1 to 2 reps. It could be then the next week a rest pause set for an extra 1 to 2 reps. Like, there's opportunities here. Now, there's an argument for maybe there being somewhat of a growth factor from metabolic demand. Occlusion training has shown this. But if you look at like the research, albeit we aren't those individuals, so but you can take this and kind of extrapolate it out, is the fact that, whether you do 10 reps, 20 reps, or 30 reps, so long as you're getting close to failure, then technically you're getting a similar hypertrophy response. The reason why I think a lot of people don't get as much out of, say, 20 and 30 reps versus 6 to 10 reps is that just by default of being heavier, you have a greater motor unit recruitment from the beginning, and your proximity to failure is more accurately represented by perceived exertion. So most people are better at getting an RIR of 2 or 3 with a 10 rep set than they are with a 30 rep set. So usually it's smarter for us to stay further away from, let's say, 20 reps and stay close towards 10 reps. All of that comes down to then the question of how do we get more progression out of an individual who is very strong? And if they're already strong at a particular load, does dropping the load and changing the execution of that change the hypertrophic response? And the question would be, it kind of depends, but you can think of this from week to week. But if you, for example, on this exercise here, this belt squat RDL, right? If you're doing a 3-second eccentric, a 0-second pause, a 1-second concentric for 280 for 10, and then next week you change it to a 6-second eccentric, it's just think of it as a different exercise. Anytime you change execution, you can think of it as a different exercise. Therefore, every week thereafter that change is a new progression. So, if I made you do this like 10-second eccentrics, the load would have to go down so significantly that you would then, or your reps would come down so significantly that then next week your comparative data is then the same execution repeated. And if you can't take progression through effort, and you know that load is a factor that may cause you more pain, then you just add more sets. So what I'll typically do is I'll find exercises for individuals where they have a really good opportunity and a really good internal focus on muscle activation to add more load over time. And the goal is just to drive more load, recruit maximum motor unit recruitment. So there's some advantages to doing this because they're the big muscle fibers. But then I will say, like, for isometric exercises like a bicep curl, for example, effort and load will typically only get you so far. So much so in that if you continue to try and drive more load and more effort, you either then just like push force into different places, like more tendon load, a secondary muscle group takes more load. There's a compensation that happens because that load becomes too difficult to stabilize and too difficult to progress, for example, right? So instead of doing that, or effort might cause you more pain, or load might cause you more pain, just add more work, And this is the simple action then we just work your sets up to find what your maximum recoverable volume is for each individual exercise in this individual program, in this individual setup. So you might say, hey, dude, like to pick this one where you took an extra set, this is this unilateral cross extension, right? You know that if you add more load to this, it's going to get a bit shifty, So instead of adding load, you try and maintain. I'm assuming you added half kilo, but let's just say this week you're like, man, it's going to get too hard. So you try and beat it with effort, but if you get to here and you can't beat it with effort, instead of changing technique just to get reps, or adding load thinking load is the primary predictor of growth, you just add one set. Now the question is like, do you need to add a full set, or can you just add a rest pause set where you just get an extra 1 rep? Do that. Next week, can you then just rest slightly longer and get 2 more reps? Next week, 3 more reps. And I would say as you add more and more sets, it's probably not worth resting long enough to take any more than 5 reps because they're kind of the most stimulatory. So like anything beyond the 5 is just accumulating more fatigue for not a significant amount more stimulus. So I'll set this baseline volume, right? Like here, we set this baseline volume for you at 78 sets for now. I mean, usually I would get this even lower for people. It'd be like 55 to 60. And then we work up effort, we work up load. And then we just start adding some sets on top of some things. And we find like, hey, dude, you could say to me, bro, by the time when I finish this unilateral tricep extension and then this overhead tricep extension, it takes me 4 days to recover. But I'm recovering before I get to here, right? Cool. All right, well, we know that 5 sets for you is okay. Next week, we add 1-on-1, 6 sets. I'm still recovering fine. We add another one, 7 sets. But then you got, by the time I get to here now, I'm no longer recovered by the time I get to the next set. That is an indicator now that your recoverability is slower than the stimulus is offering. We deload, start again. So in short, load itself is not that important, absolutely, in that if you can do 265, or what is that RDL again? So I can just refer back to that again. Where is it? Oh, I'm here. Right. So this load, if we said to you, hey,
unless you can get more than 280, you're failing. That would be a really like inappropriate way to look at this. Instead, what we can say is that let's find your maximum tolerable loads for most of this stuff, right? And then let's just add some more work to it. But sometimes it's not smart to add it to like compound stuff, right? We might be better off just saying, hey, let's sustain compound strength and add more isometric volume, you know? So I want you to challenge you for this week is keep your efforts and everything the same, but let's continue to add sets now until you say to me, dude, I'm not recovering between sessions anymore. And then we can go, all right, this is Camille's individually specific maximum recoverable volume. I'll make note of that. We'll start back at sort of lower volume and we work our way back up again. I hope that has provided some insight. But there's a general rule. The closer proximity to failure you train, the less sets you can typically get away with in a week. The further away you train, the more you have to offset that with more volume, more work. That's the difference. When you look at like these guys like Jake.
All right, program's on the screen. Let's shift to the screen recording and go through this program here so that you guys can get a bit of an understanding of how I might go about programming an individual who's trying to progress growth across the entirety of their physique with no specific, focus on anything that is asymmetrically behind, and how you might go about a very simple progression model to drive growth. Note that this is just one progression model of many opportunities to progress. It is not the progression model, but it is one that I find incredibly effective for individuals who are great at finding their true reps in reserve, how many reps they are away from failure, and then progressing that in a manner that is only progressing on an as-needed basis and not on a at all costs or just because more work seems like it's a good idea. So within this program here, what you're going to see is a setup that's pretty straightforward. We've got a 3-on, 1-off, 2-on, 1-off approach here with our programming. This individual would be focused on trying to grow their entire body, and thus there is no real asymmetrical volume landmarks here that are being set for anything that specifically needs, more growth than the other. What you'll see here is a very simple 2-part progression model for this individual. First, we're going to start off with the progression model of reps in reserve. You'll now know, having listened to the video prior to this, that effective reps or the most stimulatory reps typically kick in at around about 3 to 5 reps away from failure. I don't typically set RIRs below 3 because I find most individuals' perceived 3s are actually more like a 4 or a 5 reps from failure. So if we give people the opportunity to try and get as close to a 2 to a 3, that usually means they land somewhere around a 3 to 4, and we've always got room to progress. In the interesting case that somebody is very good at targeting failure, then that's a whole nother kettle of fish to discuss in regards to how you may manage that person's volume. But typically, training volume will start lower, and the progressive model will also be reactive like this one. So we're going to start this person on what we would classify as their baseline volume. Now for this particular individual, including calves, which they've got a fairly decent calf focus actually, it's 74 sets. I may typically have most individuals across a 5-day program at around about 58 to 62 sets. It's just that in this particular individual, they've come to me with previous higher quad volume. So this singular day that has got a lot of quad focus has got quite a significant amount of sets, which will more than likely limit their capacity to add sets over time, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. It may just mean that the set progression model for them, because this is reactive, is actually more suitable as opposed to a proactive set model, which do exist. So just to quickly clarify on that, a reactive set model is where we're going to have somebody add sets reactively to the absence of progress, whereas a proactive model might be where we add sets in a week just for the sake of adding sets, or not so much for the sake, but rather we're doing this as a means to drive more effective training volume. And it's really well suited to individuals who stay a fair way from their proximity to failure, or maybe they have some exercise limitations through injury or load or something that means that they can't really push. So there you therefore have to do more work. More effort, less work, less effort, more work. Effort here being the proximity to failure. Okay. So we're going to start off with a 2 to 3 repetitions in reserve approach here. They're going to train. We're going to move that RIR up ever so slightly in week 2, because just by default of training the same movements in the same order for a second week in a row, you'll get skill acquisition. That skill acquisition will typically mean they can add more load, and they'll be able to sustain the repetitions for the allocated rep range. Now for me, I typically like to set a repetition range of 1 to 2 reps for the first set, and then I'm happy for the second set to just end up wherever performance ends up to the allocated RIR. So week number 2 is going to be an RIR progression model, but with the expectation that we'll also see probably some load progression. Week 3, we'll more than likely see some load progression as well, but we're asking them now to get to a closer proximity to failure. So we might even see a double linear progression in here, and we'll see the same reps for more load and to a high degree of intensity or work effort, as I mentioned before, which will then drive progress across all facets of this program. Instead of then having the individual run to a 0 RIR there, now noting that as you get closer and closer to failure, the level of stimulus to fatigue, as coined by Mike Israetel at Renaissance Periodization, starts to shift somewhat more towards the fatigue and a little bit less towards the stimulus. The stimulus will get larger, but the degree of fatigue sometimes is larger as a relative percentage than the stimulus of hypertrophy that raises with it. So knowing this, instead of taking the individual immediately to a 0 RR, which may technically be the most stimulatory rep that you could possibly do, it is also going to accumulate more fatigue. And instead of having the individual have to deload and reduce their training, either frequency or amounts too frequently, I personally would rather keep them within a very good stimulatory rep model at 1 RIR, and then consider adding more work on an as-needed basis. Now, these yellow sets are for us to talk about here really quickly about why we may not do a particular set progression model for some exercises, and also maybe some modes of execution. So in this particular instance here, you've got 1 RIR plus AR auto-regulated rest pause set RPS. So what I'm suggesting here is that in the absence of progress, which would be an inability to get more reps with the same load as the week prior, or an inability to add load and sustain reps, if the individual cannot do that, they will auto-regulate 1 rest pause set on top of that to pick up the reps or pick up the progression. Really simple model. What this might look like on paper, for example, is let's just say this person was lifting 100 kilograms across 2 sets, and they got 12 reps here and then 10 reps in the second set. If they moved into this week here, and they attempted to do the same thing again but were unable, they could simply just take a third set, auto-regulate that set on a rest pause model, they might get 3 extra reps. If, for example, they took a load progression and they dipped off reps because they took too big of a load progression and they lost quite a significant amount of reps, this would call for another opportunity. Despite the fact that they've added load as a progressive model, they've lost quite a significant amount of reps, so they might again add another set here, and they might again aim for 3. If, for example, though, they do add load like this, and they maintain the repetitions from the week prior, that in itself is progress, and thus no additional set is added. This is a great model for advanced lifters as far as I'm concerned, because it means that we're only adding work when necessary, not just because, which would be the technical term for junk volume that some people were referred to in our industry. So that's how we're going to look at this model. Now, why might we not do a rest pause set on this? Primarily because this particular compound movement for them wouldn't be suitable to do that, or it may come at a greater risk for injury. So I want them to rest appropriately and just take 1 full additional set here at the same allocated rest period. They're also only doing 1 set, so 1 additional full set here is not too much. The same will apply for this mode here, which if we just pull this to the left, the mode here for us is top set with back off. So this for me is a heavy focus on progressing load, and I'm less concerned if the individual drops reps or drops tonnage or training volume. I'm more interested in this particular exercise just being a very load, mechanical tension dominant exercise, and then we will accumulate our training volume or our effective reps with the other sets, which I refer to as FAM, you would have seen, which is fatigue accumulation method, which is just a specific term that we utilize here at Flex. So in those instances where we have compound movements that are potentially risky for rest pause, like a high incline dumbbell chest press, it's very hard to press too close to failure, drop them onto your knees and then get back up in 10 to 20 seconds. So we just take full rest periods and sets for those, but we also don't take additional sets on top set back offs, because the goal here is to add more load each week, albeit even the smallest amount would be effective. All right. So this gets them through to week 4. Week 5, they then shift to a legitimate 0 RIR. And then in week 6, we take the same approach that we took here, which is to add sets on an as-needed basis as opposed to just adding them for the sake of adding more volume. And what you'll typically see then across the course of this week is you'll actually end up with maybe somewhere around a 10% set addition each week. So you might end up at, say, 77 sets here. The sets would probably be maintained here, and then we'd end up with something like 80 odd sets here. All the while, what we would be doing here is looking for feedback on an exercise by exercise basis as to whether or not they're dipping off in the stimulus as they add more sets, whether or not they're also then not recovering between sessions. And one of the indicators, as you would have seen in the last video, which I did for Camille for his check-in there, is an inability to recover in time for the session that is next up for the same muscle group might be an indication that your recovery demands now are superseding the stimulus that you're achieving out of the training, and it would be time then to deload and start again. And so guys, with that, I will leave you with the opportunity to ask questions about programming. There is no one way to program anyway. There is multiple ways to do this, but if anything, what I hope this achieves for you as watching this backstage video is that, number one, a lot of thought process goes into the programming of each athlete here at Flex, because it's important each individual gets an individual a program that is specific to them and their needs. And two is that progress doesn't come in one particular bow wrapped up. You know, it's understanding principally what is necessary for growth and then allowing yourself the opportunity to ebb and flow with a protocol that is suitable to each individual. So, like I said earlier, if you like this video, you saw value in it, please give us a like, give us a thumbs up, subscribe, hit that bell button, all that good stuff for YouTube, and we'll see you in the next one. If you like this content, remember to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. See you in the next one. Train smarter, not just harder.